Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we are going to see about tumbling window trigger in Azure Data Factory. We have already seen about the schedule trigger and storage events trigger in ADF. So if you haven't watched those videos, please do watch it. Okay, let's get started. Firstly, what is tumbling window trigger? This trigger runs a pipeline on a periodic time interval from a specified start time. Let's understand this with an example. Consider if you are setting up your tumbling window trigger for a pipeline in ADF, which is configured to run every 6 hours in a day with a start time at 12 am. What tumbling window trigger will do is, it will divide one day into 4 different sections. The first sections would be from 12 am to 6 am, and the second section would be 6 am to 12 pm, and the third would be 12 pm to 6 pm, and finally the last section would be 6 pm to 12 am. So these sections are called as windows. In each windows, the pipeline will get triggered and will process the data belongs to that window period. So since there are 4 windows, the pipeline will get triggered for 4 times in a day. This is called as tumbling window trigger. Now you can ask me a question that, then what is the difference between schedule trigger and the tumbling window trigger? Even using schedule trigger, you can run your pipeline 4 times a day. Then what exactly the difference between these two trigger? There are actually 2 big differences between them. The first one is, if you are configuring a schedule trigger for your pipeline, you can schedule the pipeline only for the future dates. You cannot schedule it for the previous dates. Whereas in tumbling window trigger, you can schedule it for the previous dates as well. This is one of the main benefits of using tumbling window trigger. Say for example, due to some reason a pipeline got failed during the last week pipeline run. Then you can rerun the pipeline using the tumbling window trigger, which can be scheduled as last week date, and thereby the pipeline can process the last week data. This is really helpful in loading some historical data or backfilling the data. Another big differences between these two triggers is, in tumbling window trigger, we have a concept called dependency. What does this dependency mean is, you can configure a trigger which will be dependent on another trigger, which means that one trigger will become active only when other trigger successfully runs the pipeline. This dependency is not supported in the schedule trigger. Let's see all about these in a demo. Now what we can do is, let's go to the Azure portal and see how we can configure a tumbling window trigger in a demo. Okay, so I'm inside the Azure Data Factory now. So if you can see here, I have created a pipeline called copy pipeline tumbling. This pipeline is a simple copy data pipeline where it copies files from the source data lake to the destination data lake. As you can see here, I have a source data lake, and inside that I have a folder called source_tumbling, where I have loaded 3 files in here. So similar to that, I have a destination data lake where I have a folder called dest_tumbling. So using that pipeline, we are going to copy the 3 files from the source to the destination. So what I'm going to do now is, I'm going to run this pipeline using the debug option to copy the 3 files from the source data lake to the destination data lake. Cool, so the pipeline run has finished. So what I'm going to do now is, I'm going to the destination data lake and hit refresh here. So as you can see here, we have copied all the 3 files from the source. Now the most important thing to note here is the modified column. As you can see here, all the 3 files have the same modified time, which is 2:37 pm. Which means that the copy data pipeline has copied all the 3 files from the source to the destination data lake at the same time. So what I'm going to do now is, in the source data lake, I'm going to upload another file. So I'll click on the upload button here. So already I have a file for this, which is testfile4.csv. So I will just drag the file and drop it here and click on the upload button to upload the file. Okay, so now we have uploaded the test file number 4 in the source. And if you go to the destination data lake, you'll not be seeing the test file number 4 here yet, unless and until you have run the copy data pipeline. So what I'm going to do is, I'll go to the Azure Data Factory Studio again, and I will rerun the pipeline. So you'll be understanding shortly why I am running this pipeline again here. So firstly, let's wait for the pipeline to finish running. Cool, as you can see here, the pipeline run is completed now. So now I'll go to the destination data lake, and before hitting refresh over here, have a closer look at the modified column. As you can see here, all the files have the same modified time, which is 2:37 pm. Okay, Now let's hit refresh button. As you can see here, the test file number 4 has been copied from the source to the destination. But if you clearly note the modified column now, all the 4 files have their new modified time, which is 2:39 p.m. The reason for this is, if you go to the pipeline again, and in the bottom you can see the pipeline run output log. So if you click on the output option here, you can clearly see that the pipeline has read 4 files from the source and written 4 files to the destination. But the problem here is that in the destination, we have already loaded the first 3 files. So even though in the source we have just added 1 file, the pipeline has copied all the files from the source and written the files to the destination data lake. This is not an optimal solution. Since we are copying the same file which has been already copied, this will lead to many issues in terms of performance, cost, and time. Because in real-time projects, we'll be dealing with enormous amount of data. And in that case, it's not a good practice to load the same data if the data has been already loaded. So an optimal solution here would be doing an incremental load, which means that only copy the data to the destination that has been newly added to the source. This incremental load can also be done using tumbling window trigger in ADF pipeline. Let's see how we can do that. Firstly, I'll go to the Azure Data Factory, and here what I'm going to do is, in this copy data pipeline, I'm going to create 2 parameters. So for that, I'll click on this new button over here, and we'll create the first parameter, which is start time. And after that, let's create the next parameter, which is end time. So now we have created 2 parameters for this pipeline, which is start time and end time. Now what I'm going to do is, I'm going to configure a tumbling window trigger for this pipeline. So for that, I'm clicking on this add trigger button over here, and we'll choose this new/edit option. Here let's click on this choose trigger drop down, and we'll choose the new option to create a new trigger. Okay, so firstly let's give a name to this trigger. So I'm going to give a name called tumbling_trigger. And the next option is description. It's an optional one, so let's skip it. After that, we have type option. Here we are going to choose the tumbling window trigger. Okay, now the next step is the important one, which is the start date for this trigger. By default, it will take the current date as the start date for this trigger. Let's go with the default start date, and we'll go to the next step, which is specifying the recurrence. This is to configure how frequently the pipeline should get triggered. We can configure this in minutes, hours, and months. In this demo, I'm going to go with the minutes option to quickly test the incremental load functionality. I will change the minutes to 5 to make the pipeline to get triggered for every 5 minutes. Okay, next we have the end date option. So if you want this trigger to be active only until certain specific period of time, then you can use this option. I'm not going to specify any end date for this demo. After that, we have advanced option, which is the most important one for this tumbling window trigger. So we have already discussed about the dependency feature in tumbling window trigger. So if we want to specify any dependencies for the trigger, then we need to do this using this advanced menu option. So for this incremental load demo, we don't need this dependency feature enabled in the tumbling window trigger. But we'll be seeing more details about the dependencies in the later section of this video. Let's go to the next option, which is annotations. This is more like a tags to this trigger to easily identify the use of this trigger. It's an optional one as well, so let's skip this for now. And finally, we have the start trigger on creation checkbox, which is enabled by default. This is to specify if the trigger needs to be active or not once it is created and published. So let's go with the default option since we need this trigger to be active. Now we have given all the required details to create this tumbling window trigger. Let's now click on this OK button. Okay, so now as you can see here, we have an option to pass the values for the 2 parameters that we created earlier in this pipeline. Here what values we are going to pass is, we are going to get the window start time and the window end time from this tumbling window trigger and pass that as the values to the start time and the end time parameters. So we have configured this tumbling window trigger to run for every 5 minutes. So say for example, if the pipeline gets triggered exactly at 10 a.m., then the window start time would be 10 a.m. and the window end time would be 10:05 a.m. Here the 10 a.m. will be passed as a value to the start time parameter and the 10:05 a.m. will be passed as a value to the end time parameter. So to get this value from the tumbling window trigger, there is a script. So I'm just going to paste the script here in the text box. This script is the Azure Data Factory inbuilt expression script. This script will get the window start time from the trigger and it will be passed as a value to this start time parameter. Similarly, we are going to get the window end time, so I'm just going to paste the same code here and will replace the start to end. Okay, so now both window start time and the window end time will be passed to these two parameters. Let's click on the OK button now. So now we have configured the tumbling window trigger, and when the pipeline runs, the window start time and the window end time values will be passed to these two pipeline parameters. So now what we are going to do is, in the copy data activity, let's go to the source tab. Here we have an interesting option which is filter by last modified. In this option, we need to specify two values which are start time and end time. Now what I'm going to do is, I'll click on this start time and will click on this add dynamic content button. Here, I'll choose the start time parameters that we created earlier. Similar to this, let's click on the start time add dynamic content button and choose the end time parameter and click on the OK button. Now what will happen is, when this pipeline runs, the window start time and the window end time values will be passed to this filter by last modified start time and end time values. Hence, the pipeline will just filter the files from the source based on this window period, which means that if a new file is added and it has a new modified time and it also lies between the window period, then only that file will be filtered and copied to the destination. This is really powerful since it is just copying the files which have been recently modified in the source. Moreover, one interesting thing to note here is, we have already discussed that you can set up the tumbling window trigger for the previous dates, right? You can use that feature along with this to make it even powerful in terms of backfilling the historical data. Say for example, if you want to load a file which has been added to the source on Friday of last week, then what you can do is, you can modify the tumbling window trigger to go back to the previous week with the 1-day window period which covers just Friday with the window start time and the window end time. And when the pipeline runs, it will just filter the files that are uploaded on Friday last week and load that to the destination. This is a great benefits of using tumbling window trigger. So now we have configured everything that is required for this incremental load using tumbling window trigger. Now what we can do is, we can publish all the changes. After publishing the changes, what we can do is, we can add one more file in the source and wait for the pipeline to get triggered and see if the pipeline just copies the file that is newly added or not. So let's go to the source data lake and upload the file. I already have a file called test.tumblingtrigger.csv. I will drag the file and drop it here and click on the upload button. Okay, so we have uploaded the new file to the source data lake. One thing to note here is that the new file have a modified time which is 3:23 p.m. No other file has the same modified time. So we need to copy just this file to the destination data lake. As you can see here, the destination data lake does not have this file. So now I'm going to the Azure Data Factory again, and inside that, I will click on the Manage tab to view the tumbling window trigger that we created earlier. So if I click on that, as you can see here, the start date for the trigger is 3:22 a.m. So this will be the window start time for this trigger. So since we have configured this trigger to run every 5 minutes, the window end trigger would be 3:27 a.m. So the first window period for this pipeline run would be 3:22 a.m. to 3:27 a.m. So in this window period, if a new file has been added to the source, then that file will get filtered and will be processed by the pipeline. As you can see here, the new file modified time is 3:23 a.m., which is between the window period 3:22 a.m. to 3:27 a.m. And therefore, we should be expecting that the pipeline will copy just this file to the destination data lake, and that is what we are going to test in this pipeline run. So for that, what we can do is, let's go to the Monitor tab in the Azure Data Factory and wait for the pipeline to get triggered. Cool, as you can see here, the pipeline is triggered now at exactly around 3:27 a.m. So I'll click on this pipeline now. As you can see here, the pipeline run is successful. So here in the pipeline run log, I will click on the input option. As you can see here, we have the window start time, which is exactly 3:22 a.m. and we have the window end time, which is 3:37 a.m. So now if you see the output, you can now clearly see that it has read just one file from the source and it has written just one file to the destination. So let's go to the destination data lake to check this. As you can see here, we have already copied 4 test files and each files have the same modified date. So now let's hit the refresh button. Cool, the newly added file in the source has been copied here, and if you note something, the modified date did not change for any of the old files, which means that only the new test tumbling trigger file.csv has been copied from source data lake to here. So this is how we can implement the incremental load functionality using the tumbling window trigger in Azure Data Factory. Okay, so now as mentioned before, I told I'll be explaining one concept in tumbling window trigger later, which is dependencies. So if you click on the tumbling window trigger and go inside the advanced menu, you can add dependencies for this trigger. Say for example, if you want this trigger to be dependent on another trigger, then you can click on this new button and select the required trigger which should be dependent on. And here you have 2 extra options, which are offset and window size. So to explain these concepts better, I will use an official documentation page provided by Microsoft. So if I go to the other tab, as you can see here, this is the official documentation for tumbling window trigger. So let's understand this dependency better with this diagram. So if you see the first diagram, there are 2 triggers, trigger A and trigger B. So both of this trigger is configured with a 1 hour window period, which is 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. and 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. So here the trigger B is dependent on trigger A. For example, what will happen here is at 9 a.m. both trigger A and trigger B will run the pipeline. But at 10 a.m. firstly only the trigger A will run the pipeline and the trigger B will wait for the trigger A to complete the pipeline. So if the pipeline runs successfully, then the trigger B will run in the window period 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. So basically here the trigger B is dependent on trigger A. Here we have an offset value 0. So we have already seen there is an offset settings in the tumbling window trigger. So what does this offset mean is, if the offset value is 0, then there will not be any time differences between the triggers. In this example, since the offset value is 0, the trigger B's dependency of 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. window matches with the same timing of trigger A's 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. window. Alternatively, there is another example of offset value as -1. Here, there is a time differences of 1 hour between the trigger dependency. Here the trigger B's 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. run is dependent on trigger A's 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. run. This is the main use of setting up the offset in the trigger. The next one is the dependency size. So this is to specify in a trigger how many number of windows are dependent with other triggers window. So here in the first example, the size is unspecified, then it works as normal window recurrence. Whereas in the second example, the window size is mentioned as 2 hours. So here, the trigger B's both window of 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. and 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. is dependent on trigger A's 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. window. This is how the window size works on the dependency. And the next one is the self-dependency option. You can also refer the same trigger to be dependent on itself. Say for example, in the trigger option, you can select the same tumbling window trigger that we created earlier. So if you want the pipeline to be triggered only when the previous window run is successful, then you can configure in this way. This is called as self-dependency. And then we have other options like delay. So this is an option where you could use to make some delay before triggering the pipeline. And after that we have max concurrency option to specify the maximum number of pipelines that could be triggered with this tumbling window trigger. After that we have retry policy count option. So if the pipeline fails for some reason, you can use this option to automatically run the pipeline again. And finally we have retry policy interval option. So using this we can specify the time interval between the number of retries specified in the above retry policy count option. So these are the advanced option of the tumbling window trigger. I think now you have a clear understanding of what is tumbling window trigger and how we could use this in the real-time projects. And finally, there is another type of triggers in Azure Data Factory, which is custom triggers. So for this custom trigger, we may need to configure the event grid system, which is completely a different type of resource. We'll be exploring about this in the future videos. So these are the different types of triggers in Azure Data Factory. I hope this video is helpful to you all. So that's it for today. So please like, share and subscribe if you like the content, and see you in another great video. Until then, cheers. Bye.